Hey everyone, it's Chris Daweski here with my Pomeranian and the Pomeran Podcast. Here to talk to you today about German handwriting. I know this has been kind of a big issue that a lot of people have wondered about. How do you read it? How do you interpret what you're looking at? There are not a ton of resources out there, and especially there's not a lot of resources out there in English. So join me, grab a beverage, and let's learn. All right, so I started doing this 7 or 8 years ago now, and I had absolutely no experience in family history at that point. I mean, I'd interviewed some family members a couple times, and that was about it. So the reality is this. A lot of my learning was taught by just by looking at things and kind of understanding what I saw. I remember when I started out, there were some very helpful people who I'd send off an image to, and they'd help me translate it. And some of these are images that now I look at and I go, how did I ever have a problem with this? Because it's second nature now. But there is a little bit of a learning curve with German handwriting. The Kurrentschrift, the Süderlin, Alta Schrift, or the old script. Really not that hard to learn once you've practiced it. And I feel like seeing visual examples of it makes it a lot easier for, at least it was easy for me, but hopefully easier for you to also be able to learn from and potentially get to the point where you don't need to have a ton of help with it either. So let's just dive in. All right, so we're going to start out talking about capitals and smaller letters. There's Kurrentschrift, there's Süderlin, in German what they call Latin, which is really more of the American typecast. We're not going to discuss that last one as much because my assumption is most of us watching this are going to have at least a basic understanding of English cursive. If you don't understand basic cursive, or if they're not teaching it in schools anymore, if you're kind of a younger viewer, my best advice is to go out and find some videos that actually teach you a little bit about the basics about what cursive looks like, because it does look substantially different from just regular print. And if you have a pretty good understanding of English cursive, this German script is going to be a little easier to understand, but it's still substantially different from what you might expect it to look like. So with that being said, let's just jump in directly to the capital letters. A lot of the capitals, regardless of if you know English cursive or German cursive, they're going to look relatively the same. For example, the letter A looks just like the English A. Let me pull up a. So, we could do it like we see there, or it could be like the letter A like that. You won't see that. It's going to be more of that lowercase a that looks like a capital. The letter B and the letter C look a little similar, and what you want to look for here is that curly Q there, and then that termination right there. Those are the two things that you're going to look for that differentiate between these letters, especially if you're looking at like a word like cannoneer. It's just going to have this opening there and continue the word. There should be a little bit of a space between here and some of the rest of the letters. The letter D looks substantially different from ours. I mean, it's still there, but it's almost like a half a letter. It's a line with like a little scribbly thing to it. The letter E, you should be okay kind of figuring it out. It almost looks like a giant letter C, but knowing what we see here with the letter C is it's going to kind of differentiate between the two of them. F and G are pretty easy to figure out. G, again, kind of follows the MO of the letter A there. It's almost like a typecast smaller letter G. It's a lot larger. The letter H doesn't look like ours. When we think of the letter H, kind of like that. The capital letter H in cursive is almost going to look like the letter Y. And it's going to come in with a lot of like the scribbly beginning to it, and you get a lot of like curves to it before going down below the line and coming back up. The letter I, some really depends on how you learned American cursive. The letter I sometimes looks like that. I write mine more like that. So it is more of that typecast, almost like a greeting card letter I. It does have a line through it. Don't get it confused with the letter T. It's not the letter T. The way you can tell that is, unlike ours where, we have, let's try that again. You've got something more like that. Their letter T does not do that. Their letter T as a capital is actually, it's got a kind of a crossbar through it, and it's very very similar in its essence to the smaller, except it's got that little wave on top to capitalize it. The letter J, again, you're dipping below the line a little bit with this. It looks similar to the letter I, but it doesn't have a line crossed through it. The two that you might actually have some of the most struggle with, just because this letter R here is not super indicative of what you're going to see. The letter K and the letter R are very similar in the way that they're written. So knowing just a little bit about in which situation you might encounter it and how the name has been written in other places in a church book might help you out. L's are pretty standard. M's and N's are pretty confusing. The letter M is going to have two scribbly things here that almost look like they're capital letter S that we'll go over here in a second. So sometimes you look at it and you're like, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. And sometimes it can be confusing to figure out, is this an M or a W? Is it Magner? Is it Wagner? Like which of the two is it? And knowing the difference between the M and the N is just knowing how many kind of curly Q's you have there at the beginning. Also, depending on the way the person wrote it, I have seen letter N's that look a lot like letter V's. Again, with those, check different areas of the church book just to see if it's still written the same way. Check with the Taufpater records. So if you look over in the other column, you might see them written differently than how they were written over in that left column, just because sometimes the priest wrote it nice and big and legible in one area and not so much in the other. I've seen that where it's more of like that Latin script in one area and then Kurrentschrift on the other side. The letter O looks like a letter O until you actually know that the capital letter S looks like a letter O as well. So the letter O is just, it's an O with a little kind of almost like I think of Dennis the Menace with that there, kind of like a little curly Q at the end. The S is going to be different because it comes around like that. Once you get familiar with the letter S, you won't be confused about it again, but to start out with, like the word Schumachermeister is a pretty interesting one to see for the first time. Letter P capitalized is not difficult to figure out. The lower letter P is, and we'll go over that in a minute. The letter Q could be written a variety of ways. This is just one of them. Still pretty typical to see it that way. We've talked about R, the S. We talked a little bit about the T as well. Capital letter U and the capital letter V. Biggest thing to look for here is that the letter really U, V, and W, because they do look pretty similar. This terminates up here and comes back down, which almost looks more like the letter A. So this is an area of confusion. Difference between A and U is that there's that open top to it. The letter V that we see here, again, looks similar to U, but once you see it enough, it's not going to be that confusing to tell the difference between, because it comes back like that there at the end. So if you're looking at it there, it comes back. Biggest thing that you're going to encounter is whether or not it's a letter V, a letter N, or a letter W, and that kind of again almost looks like the letter S. Right there at the beginning is going to be very important to be able to tell the difference between the letter V and the letter W. Also really important to be able to tell the difference between the M and the W is if you're looking here at the end. So if we're looking at that right there, that's kind of what tells us if it's an M or if it's a W. The letter X, it is what it is. It looks like a cursive X. The Y, the Z, and then sometimes the H, just depending on what you're looking at. Again, you've got this kind of a dip down in it. It comes around. If it's compressed where it looks closer together, you might struggle with this a little bit more. And then the letter Z, the difference you're going to notice here is kind of that, almost looks like a smaller letter R in the capital there, whereas the Z has this curly Q right there. So I think that's where we're going to stop off for this lesson here, and we're just going to leave it at capitals. The next video is going to talk about the lowercase letters and some of the ways that you're going to see those play out. We're also going to talk in the next couple of videos about the Suderlin capitals, and then smaller, kind of jumping off of where this video is left off, and talk about combining some of these letters as well, because they do look substantially different in a variety of cases, and it helps to be familiar with the way that the language works. So join us with that next video, and stay tuned.